Hey folks, today I want to talk to you about this sort of war of words going on in social media between a guy called Eddie Abu and another guy called Dr. Ids. I find it really interesting because Eddie represents the old school, as in basically what I was taught when I was younger. He's from Britain, and a lot of his advice mirrors what I was taught when I was a kid as well, versus Ids, who's the more evidence-based practitioner, and that's more what I'm used to now as a coach. Eddie represents me as a competitor. That is that mindset of, we've got a deadline, we need to get the job done. Whereas Ids almost represents me more as a coach. I'm going to be coaching a whole wide range of people, and I need something which is more encompassing. So I find the parallels between the two really interesting. I wanted to bring it to you guys, and it can provide some lessons for us. So Ids' whole shtick is that he picks up on people from social media and he picks apart what they're saying. He's accused Eddie of being dogmatic and potentially harmful with his dietary recommendations. Now, Eddie replied back and said that the good doctor's recommendations are just his catchmark phrase, eating. So I just find it particularly fascinating. The whole back and forth is really interesting. Before I go on, I want to just say I have utmost respect for both these two. Eddie, I've actually met once before, a long time ago. He's a lot like those old guys in the gym who taught me how to lift. He's around 60 years old. He's still in great shape, and his advice works for him and for a large proportion of his followers. So nothing but respect for Eddie and for his accomplishments. Now, in terms of Ids, again, nothing but respect for the guy. From everything that I can see, both these guys do seem to genuinely want to help. So nothing but respect, and this is not a call out video for any of these two. Okay, so firstly, just to talk to you a bit about Ids' message. Now, his message, I feel, is specifically for the masses. Okay, it's a broad appeal. Now, the problem with broad appeal advice is it lacks the specificity that some people need to actually get started, because you have all these choices, all these options, but really for some people, they want to know, well, how do I get started? Ids' advice kind of falls into two categories. The first is the main category where he's educating people on the dangers of other influences. So fads, okay, and statements which he thinks can be harmful to people. That's where I think he's gained the majority of his fame. And if you look at his Instagram, it's all stories where he's debunking people's claims. Normally, people who are stood in supermarkets and making outrageous claims about carbs and whatever else. So his whole shtick is that he watches a clip, he says, time for school, and then he educates people on why the other person was talking rubbish, in his opinion, and then he says class dismissed, and that's his whole thing. And so he's been doing that for a while now, and it's gained him a lot of popularity. In a sense, he doesn't offer a lot of his own advice of what to do. His content is much more aimed at what not to do. Now, that's not a criticism, but it's important to remember when we discuss the comparisons later on. So remember that point. The advice he gives is behind a paywall. So he gives mostly research breakdowns and informational summaries. His whole thing is he wants to give you the tools to decipher fact from fiction. It's all about debunking and mostly what not to do. You could argue that there's a ton of information out there, and he's just helping you hone down the information which might be more applicable, less dangerous. Okay. Now, when it comes to Eddie, his is a very specific message, right down to a list of foods you can eat. Very, very clear what to do, what not to do. And I could probably summarize Eddie's approach in one paragraph. So let me give it a try. I'm not scripted this, so let me give it a try. He emphasizes eating whole foods from a very short list. Most of the day, you're going to be eating high protein, high vegetables, low carbs, moderate to high fats, and then around your workouts, you're going to fit in some carbs. I would say that's a pretty decent summary of the majority of his advice. That's Eddie's approach, and you can summarize that really clearly into a couple of paragraphs of text. He would also argue that this is a good thing. He would say that nutrition should be simple. It shouldn't be complicated. Everybody should have access to good nutritional education. Eddie would argue that sometimes we're overcomplicating things, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. So they represent two very different learning styles. Now, Ids is a broader, more encompassing learning style, which requires you as the consumer to put a lot of effort in yourself. Now, Eddie requires less thought. It's more kind of out of the box. it is probably suited to people who need a rigid set of guidelines. For example, beginners. If you really don't know what to do, start with Eddie, and it's a way to progress into something that works. So let's talk about some pros and cons. Let's talk about some pros and cons, because I believe in today's society, there is room for both IDS and Eddie and what they represent. In terms of IDS, I think the pros are he encourages you to learn for yourself. Now, that's important. If you want to carry on progressing through life, it's important to be a lifelong learner, because your body changes, your needs change, your goals might change as well. So it's important to be a lifelong learner and eventually become self-sufficient and evidence-based like him. He wards you against fads, which is good. Now, the cons for IDS. I think his advice can end up putting people off, because what he does is he mocks people. That's not always the best way to get people on your side. He plays into this view that people have right now, that science can be quite arrogant. It's sort of like, this study says this, therefore you're wrong, and not only are you wrong, but you're an idiot. People don't like that, right? It kind of turns people off. So I think it's through no fault of his own, he has fallen into this sort of evidence-based category of people where they throw up a study and they say, I'm right, you're wrong, and not only are you wrong, but you're an idiot and you're dangerous. And we also see the same thing being played out right now with the training side of things. So it's very much an evidence-based shtick, which I'm not so sure is appealing to a broad range of people. Because, so let's just take an example. Let's take it away from fitness. Let's say I'm a school teacher, okay? And you're a student. And let's say you run into the class and say, look, sir, I don't believe in gravity. Okay. Now, I could mock you, right? I could mock you. I could say it's ridiculous. I could give you a whole bunch of examples, tell you to jump out the window, all that kind of stuff. But the way to get you on side would be to explain with practical examples that you can understand why your belief is wrong. Now, I think sometimes it's fair to say, let me know if you agree with me in the comments, but sometimes I think it's fair to say some of the evidence bros can come across a little bit abrasive, a little bit arrogant. It's this kind of style of speaking to say, you're wrong because I have this study, and not only are you wrong, but you're an idiot. And that is generally not the way to get people on your side, in my experience. So that's a con of his. Now, just to put that into an example, which goes back to fitness, we can look at what the evidence-based bros were saying back in about 2006, 2007-ish, I forget the exact date, with If It Fits Your Macros, right? Everybody back then was talking about macros, macros, macros. Micros were put to one side as unimportant, and the entire thing was called If It Fits Your Macros. So never mind about micros, if it fits your macros, go ahead and do it. So that was mostly pushed by evidence-based bros, and as a result, a whole generation of people completely ignored the micronutrient content and also anything which was outside of the big three: protein, carbs, and fats, like fiber, for example, or potassium, sodium. So that was a real failing of the evidence-based bros. Now, as well as that, we are starting to see some insights into another area where the evidence-based bros might be wrong, and that is with this whole idea of the food matrix. The food matrix is something which is gaining steam in science at the moment, but right now is something that most evidence-based bros are unaware of. Now, just to talk to you about it, it speaks to this idea of foods being better for us if they are in their natural state. So things like saturated fat, which is commonly viewed as being bad for us in mainstream circles. All you low carb guys, don't start downvoting, okay? I'm about to be on your side here. The saturated fat, which is generally seen in the mainstream as being negative, has been a bad thing for your health. The food matrix says that within its natural state, like in dairy or in unprocessed meats, is perfectly fine. And we are starting to see some support for that in the science, but all the evidence-based bros haven't fully accepted that yet. But we are starting to see that they were wrong about that. So that's another area where the science is catching up. So I'll give you this quote from a study that I pulled out. Whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate are saturated fat rich foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with increased risk of CVD. And that study is in the description. Feel free to read it for yourself. But it talks a bit more about this idea that as science moves on, some of the evidence-based bros may actually be left behind, whereas the practical bros who've been doing it all along and have been getting good results are actually quite in the right there. That is just one example where I think the evidence-based bros, they don't help themselves when they deliver information in a very abrasive way, because sometimes they're wrong. So where's the apology? Where was the apology for Ifovich macros? How many of those guys stood up and said, yeah, you know what, my bad, we were wrong about that? Not many. So I just think it helps to tone down the abrasive nature of some of these guys when they just throw up a study and go, I'm right, you're an idiot. Again, not a personal criticism, but a fair one, I think. Now, in terms of Eddie, let's look at the pros. A lot of people are absolutely exhausted by the wide range of recommendations. A lot of people would look at ID's recommendations and just think, this is too much. I'm a busy mother of 3 kids. I work a job. I just want a clear set of rules I can do, which is practical. Help me out here. I don't have the time to get evidence-based. I don't have time to educate myself. I just want a starting point. And either that's true as well, because when I was a school teacher, you can give as much theory as you like, but if you don't put up a working example on the board, your students are going to be lost. So Eddie represents a starting point for a lot of people, which is a clear set of rules. And for a lot of people, that might be all they need. Get them on the right track, make them drop £10, £20, they're happy, great. I think the evidence-based bros can sometimes gatekeep the information via complexity. So with Eddie, you don't need any nutritional background to understand what he's saying. This is good, this is bad, go for it, right? It will get you results. It's simple, it's performance-based. Now, the cons for Eddie, his advice could be seen as being quite restrictive. I think that's fair to say. For example, rather than take a general philosophy and apply it to your own circumstances, you remain rigid, which is not great for progressing through life. Now, Eddie himself is a pretty good example of that, because he recently himself got out of shape. He's got back into shape. So clearly his approach wasn't that sustainable for him. So, again, not a criticism, but worth bearing in mind. In conclusion, I think in today's world, there is room for both the IDs and the Eddies. I think they can live together in harmony. They both bring something to the table. As a coach and a former school teacher myself, I can see the benefits in both their approaches. Really, the message of this video transcends Eddie and IDs, and it points to the argument that we're currently having between the evidence-based crowd and the bros. Traditionally speaking, the bros have always looked down upon the nerds, saying, you don't have any practical experience. And now we're seeing a reversal of that, where the evidence-based crowd are looking down upon the bros and saying, well, you don't know anything because this study says this. And I think there needs to be a bit more respect on both sides. We cannot look down upon decades of anecdotal evidence which has gotten results. We would be arrogant to do that. But at the same time, every bro would pick up on new things that work. If somebody told him in the gym, hey dude, try this. I did this last time in my prep. It worked great. They would try it. So I think some of the bros need to have a bit more acceptance and realize that the way that they've been doing things for the past few decades, trying things, that's all the evidence-based bros are trying to do. Really, the message of this whole video transcends Eddie and IDs. It's more about this ongoing war we have between the evidence-based crew and the bros. I think if both parties just spoke to each other with a bit more respect and came off as less abrasive, then they were more likely to listen to each other. I mean, come on. If you listen to some advice and the guy telling you the advice, he's abrasive, he calls you an idiot, he says you suck, are you going to listen to him? Probably not. So if both sides just started to act more like adults and treat each other with a bit of respect, I think as a whole, the rest of us who are just trying to wade through all the information that's out there would have a much easier time, and as a community we would progress forward much better. But you know what, that's not a very popular message because everybody likes the drama, so screw everyone, I hate them all. That's the end of the video. See you next time.